So let's get started. Thank you guys for coming. My name is Evgeny Yukechev. I'm a publisher and chief editor of the Type Journal. And I'm happy to introduce you to Gerd Fleischmann, the professor of typography, an author, researcher. And Gerd are going to speak tonight about Bauhaus typography. I should say this is a quite peculiar theme, and I believe you have heard not so much about Bauhaus typography as a thing, and I hope this evening will change something on this issue. So please welcome Gerd Fleischmann.
Thank you. Well, thank you. First of all, I must apologize that I don't know Russian. So talk about me what you like. I won't understand anything. And don't expect that you will earn any ruble more after this lecture. It's not for profit. Just say for entertainment, maybe for enlightenment. I try to introduce you to a theme, Evgeny already said, which is not widely known. And in fact, the title is What the Hell is Bauhaus Typography? You will learn later why this question is the right question to what I show you. The Bauhaus typography was the issue of a book I had made for Egidio Marzola, who is luckily with us, the editor of that book, in 1984. Listen, 1984. This is the starting point for the Macintosh. Probably you all know this famous Macintosh video. You ever have seen? With this wonderful woman in a colorful dress and all these gray slaves in front of the great brother. And she is running there with their hammer. Originally, it was a baseball tool, but when they started the film, they made this film in Britain, and they had a hobby hammer art sports woman, and she decided that he takes a real hammer, and then he runs towards the great brother. Well, tell me, who knows the film? Oh, so most of them. The others should see this film after the lecture. I don't want to show it here, but you should see it. It's the most famous film for advertising ever made. And it was only shown once between part 2 and part 3 of an American football mastership. So this film is called 1984 because 1984 was the title of George Orwell's novel 1984. And 1984 is the Macintosh against IBM, the great brother. But 1984 is the starting year for the TED conferences. You have ever heard of the TED conferences? Technology, Entertainment, Design, which have become very famous and now have a lot of satellites. And this is what you should watch too. Anyway, back to the Bauhaus typography. Evgeny, whom I didn't know before, once asked whether he can make a Russian edition of that book, which was the first book ever that dealt with the typographical work at the Bauhaus. And, well, we started to discuss the project, but very shortly we had to realize that the royalties today are tremendous. When we published this book in 1984, nobody asked for royalties, but for the second edition in 1995, there were some problems, but I won't talk about this. It's a secret, but Egidio knows. Anyway, but today, it's about 500 illustrations. Today, the royalties alone for one illustration may go up to 100 euros, and you can say what it's in rubles. So we try to figure out how to manage it, because I don't know the copyright in Russia. I only know the copyright in Germany, but I know some special copyrights in America, in the US, for educational purposes. So there are most things are free. And this year, in 2017, the rights of Laszlo Mojhoi-Nagy, one of the masters of the Bauhaus, are free because it's 70 years he's dead now. But this is not sufficient to have these royalties for free. Anyway, this was the inducement to come here to Moscow. I'm the second time here. I was invited to the conference Cerebro Naboro, the type conference last year, but I didn't learn much about Moscow. I was just in the conference and walking from the hotel, few corners, and then that's it. But today, I learned a bit more, and yesterday, and I hope to come back once, because I have to leave tomorrow. Today, with the internet, you don't need a lecture in general, because if you know the right questions and the right catchwords, it's quite easy to study. And this goes so far that there is a school in Paris, 42, where there are no lecturers at all. The students learn by trial and error from each other. Anybody ever heard of 42? Okay, one, tell your other students. But it's hard to get in there. About 70,000 apply every year, and they only take about 1,000. So you can imagine how hard it is to get in. It's a school, maybe Yandex may be interested in it, because it's for programming. It's, I think, for the same work you do, more or less. So a lecturer is no longer needed if every user knows the right questions to get more knowledge or to enrich his experience. But still, not all people know the right questions. Not all people are used to go this way from one catchword to the next one and then build the framework, and within this framework go deeper. And that's something you can train, but you can train on your working desk. Well, I must disappoint you or disillusion you. In fact, there is nothing that honestly can be labeled as Bauhaus typography or Bauhaus style, because the Bauhaus was a school from 1919 to 1933 with different phases and different directors as well. But the Bauhaus started in an atmosphere when nobody could imagine what design and industry can cooperate or how they can cooperate. And the word design wasn't yet used. It was all still art, more or less, and all teachers were artists. And the chapters will be this illustration, and then I will talk about the first commercial commission the Bauhaus got. It was emergency money. They were always in lack of money, but emergency money was the first commission. And I would like to tell you a bit about the political, social, and economical situation, because like Yandex, you are in a context, and the Bauhaus was in another context. And you may reflect, when I talk about the Bauhaus context, what your context is. And I would like to remind some artistic movements of the time, and then the main Bauhaus concept, which applied starting in 1923 to the work of the Bauhaus, fine art and technology or industry. In German it's Kunst und Technik, but Technik can be translated with technology, but technology is not sufficient because industry is the focus of this new idea. And the Bauhaus had to leave its first place in Weimar for political reasons. The right-wing parties got the majority, and then they kicked out the Bauhaus because it was too revolutionary. Some said it was too socialist. And the mayor of Dessau was a small town, but they had a very important company, Junkers. Maybe anybody has ever heard of Junkers. Junkers was the first airplane fully constructed in metal. Before, like in World War I, these were wooden constructions with textile and all this stuff, easy to burn. You just could shoot them and it was on fire. But the Junkers aircraft, they were totally in metal. And this was their special effect. But this was the reason in the future that Dessau was completely destroyed by the Allies, because they had this important manufacturer in town. And they didn't, the Allies didn't destroy only this factory, they destroyed the whole town. Then I want to add a chapter about the core of this typographic things, elemental typography. And finally, I want to talk about the different styles that can be identified. The Bauhaus, and this is an ad from 1926, the Bauhaus tried in this time to cooperate with industry, and they offered their workshop and their design capabilities to the public, that the public can place orders in the Bauhaus. Bauhaus Dessau, Druckerei und Reklameabteilung. This means print shop and advertising department. And they say it's time to announce the special capabilities of our department, printing and advertising. Starting with elemental design, we take orders to produce designs and advertising campaigns, and even the printing of it, like forms, prospectus, posters, catalogs, and other printed matter. And they present that the power of this advertising and of the printing of the Bauhaus has a psychological effect due to its artistic form. Whatever this means, they tried to go to the market with their own printing office, which was a small place. And one of the first commissions was emergency money. In Germany, in 1923, there began a big inflation. And the Bauhaus student, Herbert Bayer, designed emergency money in a new style, which is based on rectangles, which is based on layers, and which reduces all typography to sans serif typefaces in very strict manner of design. They only had to use these signatures of the bosses of the bank and of the government, but all other words are set in sans serif type. In comparison to what was usual at that time, sorry, let it. Now, it's mine. So I didn't expect, no. Forget it. The usual design was like this. It was emergency money of a small town. And nobody had the idea to use the modern design principles to the money. Only Herbert Bayer did this. The usual typography looked like this. And this is about the series of this money. Herbert Bayer states in an ad for the Bauhaus print shop, based on elemental design principles, the Bauhaus print shop and advertising department offers graphic design for all media, the elaboration of advertising strategies and print jobs. All in capital letters, though the official Bauhaus type was strictly lowercase. So this was a mix. The Arbeitsrat für Kunst, the Working Committee for Art, was an initiative to popularize art. Another example was the magazine Wedge. And this is a list of all avant-garde magazines of the time. And you see Der Sturm, Ma, The Style, ABC, Wedge, G, Merz. Maybe you know the Kurt Schwitters, Lev, Bauhaus, Block, Das Neue Frankfurt, and I-10. So all these magazines were in the time when the Bauhaus was active, more or less. Some were longer, some were earlier. But one of the first magazines, or the first pamphlets, was Marinetti's Les mots en liberté futuriste. The futurists were a movement, maybe you know about it, which were influential, aggressive, playful, and they called themselves revolutionary. At the Bauhaus, there was still lettering in a very playful manner, like this one. You even can see how the student who designed this liked to play with the letters, filled in the letters, as you all have done at school when the lessons were boring. You were painting in your copies. This is the timetable of the Bauhaus lectures in 1921 to 22 in the winter semester. And if you look at this W, it's not really readable. You just have to know it, and it's not hard to understand it, but it's in no way functional. This one is still very expressive, and it mixes lowercase and uppercase letters. It mixes letters of different styles. And if you see the B, it's almost no longer a letter. Or this small thing to say that drawing is in the evening at 7 o'clock. Very playful, and maybe the name Johannes Itten as an artist and a teacher is known. The other side is the influence of the Dutch De Stijl. There is nothing like functionalism or function. It's just playful, and the artist was trying to make a vision, to give a form for the vision of utopia. It was a magazine which had different aspects. This was another try to elaborate typographic forms in emphasizing words in a way that is unused before. For example, this one in German, question is it ever possible to teach and to understand? So, is teaching and understanding possible at all? This is a question you must put in every school, in every course, even in a lecture. Is it possible to understand? This seems to be very functional, but in fact it's playful, because the coloring is not logical at all. It's decorative. But it's the title of the first book of the Bauhaus to show to the public what the Bauhaus does. Because Staat, which means in German state, and house has nothing to do with each other. Because staatliches Bauhaus, the state Bauhaus, and the school is the sense. So we would expect to have the adjective in one color and the substantive in the other color. But both are divided in two colors. It doesn't make any sense from the content, from the so-called function. But it's beautiful to look at. This was the first great publication of the Bauhaus in Weimar. A special aspect in Germany was the use of different typefaces. The Fraktur, or in this case Alte Schwabacher, which is a special type of Fraktur, and the Renaissance lettering, Antiqua, and the sans serif lettering on the base. And these three systems existed parallel. I don't know whether you have in Russia anything like this. You have only one alphabet which is has more or less this form or that form, but it's only one alphabet. But in Germany of that time, you had the black letter, you had the Latin letters, and you had the grotesque, as we called them, that existed since 150 years at that time, coming from England. But most printed matter was done in Fraktur, the upper one, which is Schwabacher in this case. And the argument was, why do we need 4 alphabets to express one sound? And therefore, A plus A plus A plus A is, and it has become bold, is A. The general aesthetics in the early Bauhaus in 1943 looked like this. They had not yet any typographical style. They used what was the typography of the time. This was the invitation to the first Bauhaus exhibition in 1923. The Bauhaus was founded in 1919 and was urged to show the effect of the teaching. The state wanted to have a kind of proof that it makes sense to send people there. And you see the difference. This is still traditional typography, but in designing the program, they started to introduce new elements. They introduced a sans serif type. They introduced bold lines. They mixed uppercase lines with lowercase, which you had in the traditional typography as well. But here it's with emphasis, and you have these days, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and you have Ausstellung, which means exhibition. You have program with a playful P, that the upper part of the P forms the line with the rest of the letters. And then the Bauhaus did not want to use any longer the traditional illustrations. They wanted to reduce everything to the elements which are available in the typecase. And these are the elements. And this is an example how the elements can be used. The first sign, you know this cross from the Red Cross. Here it is black. It's for sanität, so for healthcare. The second one is the single person involved in this process. It's the doctor. The third one, nobody can understand why the third one has its emphasis in the center. It's the female doctor. So make your own rhyme on this. Maybe you can, the male doctor and the female doctor, compare, whatever you think. And the fourth is the doctor to help when a child is born, therefore the plus sign. And the fifth one is for the eye doctor. The balance is quite strange because the eye doctor is the heaviest sign of all, and it's kind of blind because these are the two dots of the sign of the blind, the three dots. And the doctor with this piece below, and the female doctor in a different way. But it's very strange. This is what the Bauhaus tried in the early time. But the influence from Russia was important because after the revolutions, a lot of Russians went to Germany, and the statistics are not consistent. You can read there were 300,000, and in other statistics, 400,000 of Russians who emigrated to Berlin. But nobody knows the right number. And two immigrants founded the magazine West. Hope I pronounced it almost right. No, I don't know any Russian. Sorry for this. Yeah, that's right. And it was published in 3 languages. You can easily read the right one. And the idea of this magazine was to bring the new ideas from the West to Russia. But this failed. And West only had number 1, 2, and number 3. Then it was stopped. Because there was no real effect in Russia at that time, in 1922. At the Bauhaus, in the middle of 1923, a young Hungarian artist became a teacher, Laszlo Mojnár. He was not, had no profile as a designer. He had no profile as a publisher. But he had a great interest in communication and in publishing, and he introduced to the Bauhaus the idea of publishing. Before, they made art prints and things like that, but he insisted on having regular publications. And this table of contents is from the first book the Bauhaus published, and he used some bold lines, some large figures. It's Romanesque 1 and Romanesque 2. Quite strange because those three bold elements form their own rhythm without relation to the rest of the text, which is in traditional typography. But these elements are the real message. The word on top reads Inhaltsverzeichnis, table of contents. But if you look at this, you see the bold line separately. And you have to look twice to realize, oh, well, it's the I of the word Inhalt, contents. It's playful, and it's more an image than a page to read. And the same system continues with the bold lines. And, for example, these lines have don't play any role in the contents. They are just giving rhythm to the page. They are more a picture. The same in the other page. To separate the small text from the titling is already done by the indent. And you don't need this bold line, but it makes a picture of it, an abstract picture. Even this element, like a ladder, you can climb the contents. It's the table of contents. And no, it's not the table of contents, it's a list of the Bauhaus books, and just gives you an idea of the aesthetics of the Bauhaus. This continues in the series of Bauhaus books, and the only one that was published in Russian was Fotografie, Malerei, and you can read it in Russian better than me because I don't know Russian. Here you see a spread from this book, and you see these elements, these typographic elements, continue. So everybody can see that this is a special argument as it has an indent. But at that time, they used bold elements to emphasize the contents. Laszlo Mojai, who entered the Bauhaus in 1923, shortly before the first public show of the Bauhaus. He was Hungarian. He had gone to Berlin in 1921, and in Berlin, where the Russians were working as well, about 200 publishing houses, Russian publishing houses, were active at that time in Berlin. So Berlin was a Russian colony in some way, but not the majority. Today it's a bit similar because Russians are moving to Berlin, but Russians are buying a lot of houses in Berlin, especially in one area called Charlottenburg. This was the Russian quarter at that time in the early 20s, as well as today. Sometime it may be called Little Russia, like in America. So you see these lines to emphasize the contents. This is a film script by Laszlo Mojinovic, who introduced definitely typography in the Bauhaus, because before he came, typography was not a subject in the Bauhaus. The printing was an art printing for etchings and lithography. And they had no facilities with type or any professional printing. They had a bookbinding shop, but they had only lithographic and etching presses. You see what they did with the lines in the later time. This is a grid in which the different scenes of the film, this is a film script, were introduced, and this is a program, a prospectus later, where you have these bold lines that you can't miss the beginning of the chapter. You wouldn't miss today because you are used to read now, but at that time probably it was necessary to have a bold line. This is the starting point. Start to read. Laszlo Mojinovic introduced photography into the Bauhaus. He was not a trained photographer, but he had the idea that photography is the medium of the time, and photography is much quicker than anything else, quicker than illustration, more realistic. So you can lie with photography as well. And most photographs are lies. And they are made as lies. And then photography and space was another theme, like this one. This is from later. This one is from about 1925, and this one is 1929 about, and it was an advertising for the most sold Bauhaus product, the wallpapers by the Rasch company. Rasch, and you read Bauhaus, and you read the modern manufacturing and the modern prospectus. Karte means the prospectus with the different wallpaper samples. Here you see another advertising for wallpapers. Tapeten is the German word for wallpapers. And wallpapers were offered as an alternative to painting walls, because the paints for walls had not the quality we know now. Now a painted wall is much more durable than a wall with kind of wallpaper. But at that time, there didn't exist the paints we have today. The glue was rather poor, and if you have a painted wall and there is some humidity coming, the glue goes back, and the wall is no longer good and no longer nice. The Bauhaus, as I mentioned before, was in Weimar for a certain time, and then for political reasons they were kicked out. And the town of Dessau accepted them. Dessau was an industrial town. I mentioned the aircraft Junkers. And in Dessau, things changed. Industry and industrial processes were more respected than in Weimar. Weimar was mostly art. And when Laszlo Mojinovic came, the lift to sorry, it will end. When Moholy-Nagy came, typography was introduced, and one of his students was Herbert Bayer, and Herbert Bayer became teacher when the Bauhaus moved to Dessau, where our memory of the Bauhaus is based. I think if somebody says Bauhaus, you have all in mind this building with the glass facade, and nobody will think of Weimar. The real Bauhaus seems to be in Dessau. And this is what in Dessau was offered as typographic work. We have still the bold lines, and you have the lowercase typography, because in 1925, the Bauhaus decided that they only use lowercase. In German, usually you have uppercase and lowercase letters, and you have the mix, as you have seen before. But there was a man who sold office furniture, and he had the theory to reduce everything to lowercase. And this idea was accepted by the Bauhaus people, and the Bauhaus decided to use lowercase exclusively. Remember the ad I showed as the second slide? It was all in uppercase. And this discrepancy will come later again, that they preached for lowercase, but they used uppercase. So don't believe what somebody is preaching. Here, for example, the ad again, and you see the same Bauhaus that had this belief. They did it like this because they thought it's more effective for them. The public was used to uppercase lettering, so they want to sell something because this is the title page of a catalog of Bauhaus products. And this is the label of the Bauhaus department, which sells products and licenses. So as the public is used to these uppercase titles, why not? Forget what I said yesterday. And the same with this ad for the print shop. They use uppercase lettering, though they were preaching for lowercase typography. Look, this is what they were preaching. This is what they were doing. But none of us is free of this discrepancy. We are preaching something sometimes, and we are doing the opposite as well. So I think nobody of you is free of this. But the Bauhaus wasn't the only place that used this kind of typography. Another great initiative, not in graphic design nor in typography or whatever, but in building, in housing, was the city of Frankfurt, where they needed a lot of housing. And there was a lack of housing at that time in Germany. This was in 1926. And they had a magazine which applied the new style fully. Though there were some ads still in the old style, Zoologischer Garten, the zoo, but the zoo paid for this ad. Let them go. Why must they be modern? Let them go, and the zoo is in black letter. Whereas the other ads were set by the people who made the magazine, who were strictly modern. And you realize that the typeface is near the Futura. The Futura was designed by Renner in Frankfurt, but this is not yet Futura. But it's about Futura coming. Another spread from the same magazine. And you see these bold lines, which slowly disappear. This was 1926. And this was the same time at the Bauhaus by Herbert Bayer, who used photography in a mix with type. And in this case, he used a previous magazine, folded it, added some elemental pieces, this one, and the square. Made a photograph, and this became the title of the next magazine. A totally different approach of what you see here. To remind you the context, this was the aesthetics of the time, and this was what Bauhaus and others who were in the modern movement published. (1925) to honor Mr. Gutenberg. Now, the Bauhaus itself, you may all have in mind the Bauhaus building from photographs. Hope so. But in this photograph from the time, you see Junkers. I mentioned the Junkers factory before, the aircraft factory. They made, they cooperated with the Bauhaus and they made the aerial views. And the Bauhaus was built in somehow nowhere. It was outside of the town. And this narrow road with the trees now is a large road. At that time, it was called Friedenstraße, Peace Road. Today it's called Walter Gropius Road, to honor the Bauhaus director. And I wonder whether you know the architecture well and you know what the different parts of the Bauhaus are. Should I explain, or do you know? Yeah? You don't know, or I don't explain? So the idea was to build a school, and the trick of the Meyer was that they needed a school for vocational education. So the Bauhaus was kicked out from Weimar and tried to find a new place. And the mayor of Dessau accepted them, invited them to come to the city. And his plan was to unite it with the demand for a school for vocational education. So this part is not Bauhaus. This part is for what the town needed. This part is the famous building you have all seen on images with this glass facade. Today we would say bad architecture, because the sun heats the inner space. And they had not these glasses we have today, these isolating glasses. It was simple glass, and the space was heated because the sun came directly here. Here you have the theater space, and in this bridge was the director and several offices and so on. And this house, which was called Preller House, were students' homes. Students could live there, like Bayer and so on. They were housed there. And the whole building was a combination of the new school of a totally new format, the Bauhaus, and traditional school for vocational education, combined with a home for students, and all built in a certain rhythm, which you can't explain. You accept it and you feel it, or you miss it. In Dessau, the Bauhaus had a print shop for the first time, and you remember the ad from the beginning. It was for the print shop in the basement. Unfortunately, there is nothing left of that print shop. Now there is a cafe. You just can enter, and you can think, oh, well, the noise of the machines, but you only can hear the espresso machine. This was the print shop. You see, it's all crafty. There is no machine. It's all hand-driven presses, used presses. As the Bauhaus had not much money, they had used type, used presses, not used paper. I think they used new paper. But all these achievements of the Bauhaus in graphic design or typography or whatever you want to say was not really published by the Bauhaus itself. It was published by Jan Tschichold, then a young trained typographer and calligrapher and designer, as we would say today, who never attended the Bauhaus, but he had visited the Bauhaus in 1923 when the Bauhaus had a big exhibition to show the results of this teaching. Gropius said, the director then, this is much too early because we are only working for 3 years and the results are not what we really want. But they were pressed by the government of Thuringia to show what they do in 1923. But in 1925, the young Jan Tschichold, who had visited the Bauhaus exhibition in 1923, published the new style in the magazine of the Printers Union. So the Bauhaus published their own results too, but the distribution was restricted. And the edition of the first Bauhaus publication, bigger publication, was about 3,000, the print run. Whether they really printed 3,000, nobody knows. But in the imprint, you can read 3,000. And it was addressed more or less to the art world, to the intellectual world, and it did not reach to those who are really in the printing business. Whereas Tschichold had contacts with the Printers Union, and therefore when he published this magazine, the title of this special magazine, Typografische Mitteilungen, Typographical News, the union's periodical, he published a special issue, Sonderheft, Elementare Typografie, Elemental Typography. Originally, he wanted to name this Bauhaus Special. But when he started to work on this magazine, he realized that this movement, this modern movement, is quite more than only the Bauhaus with Bayer and Moholy-Nagy and these people. And you can read, I hope you can't read from there. No, it's hard for you. Nathan Altman. Anybody knows him? Nathan Altman. Oh, it's a man who is forgotten from your country. Otto Baumberger. Anybody knows? Swiss. Herbert Bayer. Okay. I mentioned him, you know. But did you know Herbert Bayer before? One. And what did you know from Herbert Bayer? The money I showed you?
No, not really. Well, he's quite famous. Later immigrated to the United States and made a...
Yes, but do you know a work of him?
Of course I know. Not the money instead, because the money that you actually show now, I think it's not the really famous, not the most significant works of him.
But it's important at the starting point. And with this money, everybody in Thuringia had the Bauhaus in the pocket. So you must imagine the totally new design. I showed you the other emergency money. This was the general style. If you go to your computer tonight, just try to type in Not Geld, N-O-T, G-E-L-D. Not means emergency. Geld means in German money. And you will find a lot of decorative pieces like this money from Weißensee I showed you before, only one example. And you will realize the revolution, the design revolution Bayer's money was. Because nobody else made such a radical break with the traditions how money is designed. Only in the Netherlands you have money which is a bit similar to the modern style of Herbert Bayer. But if you look at your money, or the French money, or whatever, it's not in such a way brilliant and straight away like Bayer's emergency money. And I think this money is a landmark in the design at the Bauhaus, but Herbert Bayer was only one person. Nobody else designed like him. So, Herbert Bayer, Max Burchardt. Okay, you know all. And Lisitsky for sure. Here he is called Ladislaus Mохой-Nagy. In fact, he's called in Hungarian László. Farkas Molnár. Here you have the Christian name first, and then the family name second. Here you have the family name first, and the Christian name second. Maybe he didn't know what's right. Johannes Molzern, Kurt Schwitters. You all know the name, Kurt Schwitters? You know. Okay. Well, if you have any question, ask him. He knows. Bart Stam? No? This famous Dutch guy. Nobody knows Mark Stam? Well, take your handy, go to the internet.
Russia.
What?
He was in Russia.
Yes, he was in Russia too. But, okay, you found him. And Ivan Tschichold. Tschichold is a very strange name. It's not German. It's a small group. They are called, I don't know the English word. In German, they are Sorben. They are in the east and southern corner of Germany. And this is a special folk, which is not German, definitely, but it's a minority there. And he reduced the letters of his original name to Tschichold. But at that time, he changed his name Johannes in sympathy to socialism into Ivan, sometimes with a V, sometimes with a W. So he changed because he wasn't quite sure. And these are all the typographers that were in this copy of Elementare Typography, which was published 2 years after the first publication at the Bauhaus in new typography. On the edge, you see a logo designed by Kurt Schwitters. And this uses elemental forms. The E almost doesn't look any longer like an E. It looks more like a fork in composition with this bold circle and this bold line. It's a logo for the famous company Pelikan. Maybe you have seen other works by Lisitsky, for example, Pelikan. They made writing inks and writing pens and all this stuff for offices. But this was a radical design by Kurt Schwitters. So far as I know, never used by the company. It was too radical because they wanted to sell their stuff not only to modernists, which was only a few, but to a wider public. Just to have a list to memorize, these are the names of all designers that were with works in this special issue, Elementare Typography. And this issue originally was planned with the title Bauhaus Typography, Bauhaus Typography. But when Jan Tschichold, who was the editor, started with the work, he realized, oh, well, it's not only on the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus is only a small part of this movement of new typography, or as he labeled it, elemental typography. Nathan Altmann, already mentioned, Russian. Otto Baumberger, Swiss. Herbert Bayer, original Austrian. Max Burchardt, German. Lisitsky, Russian. Ladislaus, as he was named by Tschichold, which is a Germanization of the original Hungarian name Laszlo. Molnár Farkas, which should read Farkas Molnár, because Molnár is the family name. But they were not so strict at that time, I think. Johannes Molzahn, a German. Kurt Schwitters, you know him. Mart Stam, Dutch. And Ivan Tschichold. Ivan. He was proud to be close to socialism, while he never was really a socialist. The so-called Bauhaus typography had such different results. And these are three of the Bauhaus people who were designing typographical work. Herbert Bayer, the cover of the first Bauhaus publication. When the Bauhaus was urged to show what they do, what the results are, Herbert Bayer made this title, which is famous, but in fact, it's completely nonsense. Because the color has no functional sense. For example, here, the contents is 1919 to 1923. But why is emphasis on 9 to 192? Nobody knows. It's just a decorative manner, and it attracts the looker. Stadthaus in W makes no sense, but it creates a certain rhythm which has as a result the attraction of the viewer. And you forget about the nonsense. And you start to love this nonsense because you can read it and it's not hard to read it, but it attracts you. We have, I don't know whether this is in English known too, the cognitive dissonance, that there is a dissonance between what you are expecting and what you see. And in this conflict, you can emphasize your message. And I feel, though they didn't know this concept at that time, it was developed, I think, only in the 50s or what. This coloring attracts, whether it's functional or not, but if you have once seen this cover, you never forget it. Maybe you don't remember where which color was, but you have the impression of a certain rhythm. And this is what Bayer did, I think. He didn't think functional. He just had this page. He had this uppercase letters. He had the figures. And he had figures that usually don't exist in type. It's an L or an I or whatever, but there is no font where you have a number 1 in this form. But this cover is attractive, though it's not really functional or really following reading attitudes. So this was one thing. The second one, the poster for the first exhibition the Bauhaus had to hold by Joost Schmidt in the same year is totally different. It's hand-lettered, it's hand-drawn lithography. And the third one by Moholy-Nagy, oh, there's a mistake. An L is missing, sorry for this. I didn't see it before. But you know this name anyway. Maybe you haven't seen that the L is missing. Just expecting the name. Anybody has read Moholy-Nagy, which is Hungarian Moholy-Nagy? No? I see it the first time. Okay, this is the third style that exists at the same time, 1923, 1924. And there you see what I said first, that there is no consistent typographic style. These are 3 persons who do 3 different designs. This kind of design is widely known and widely identified with Bauhaus. though it was not only used at the Bauhaus, as you saw before in the magazine title of Das Neue Frankfurt. And here are a few samples of typographical work at the Bauhaus. For a lot of printed matter, they had to use, in the first time, printers in town. So they had not full access to what they do. They had to describe them what they should do, but the printers had their own ways of work. And the sign for the Bauhaus, this face, was created by Oskar Schlemmer using only typographic material, lines and dots. And you see, even here, it's not consistent. You have this one with two small lines near the eye and the other one without. But it doesn't matter, because if you have identified this logo once, when the lines are missing, you still recognize it. And this is proof of quality of this logo, because the rhythm from top to bottom is so convincing that you can leave the eye off as well, and you still will recognize it. Some more of the stuff. Just to give you a few names. Maybe you remember one or the other. I don't know whether you have Bauhaus as a subject in your courses. Have you in your courses, Bauhaus? But you're all students of the design school. No? But you are employees of Yandex in development, and you are not in the design business, or?
No, in design. We are in design business, but not many of us has graphic education or art education.
Ah, I thought that.
We have no good education for design.
It's funny. It's funny to say we are in design.
Welcome to Russia.
But you are using InDesign as a program as well. So this is, well, think of the labeling, a product called InDesign, which is a fantastic idea. You are InDesign? Okay, we use InDesign. Okay, just to give you a few names of the students or the teachers who were involved in typographic design at the Bauhaus, just to have it read once. Herbert Bayer, I think the most important regarding the future, because Herbert Bayer had a big influence in America. Friedel Dicker, a student who did fantastic typographic work, but not in the modern sense. Franz Ehrlich, who finally designed the gate for the concentration camp of Buchenwald in Bauhaus typography. Nobody realized this at the beginning. Johannes Itten, I don't know whether these names, you are used to these names. Karl Peter Röhl, one of the students, Hannes Meyer, which you should know because Hannes Meyer was important for some aspects of architecture in Russia. Laszlo Mojoj, now the name how it is written in Hungarian. Farkas Molnar, Oskar Schlemmer, Joost Schmidt, Henrik Stefan, another Hungarian, and Margit Terry Adler. These are the main names if you discuss about typographic work at the Bauhaus. There are more students and teachers who did some typographic work, but these are the main names. And the best known experiment or the best known typeface that was developed at the Bauhaus was this alphabet by Herbert Bayer. The idea at that time was to reduce forms to basic geometrical elements. Today we know that type doesn't work like geometry because we still are used to type as a result from writing. And the approach of the early Futura and the approach of Herbert Bayer at the Bauhaus was just to use geometric forms. But this doesn't work, and you see the missing rhythm of these typefaces. But for this, the Bauhaus became famous. Even one of the Bauhaus typographers had not a consistent style. These are three works by Joost Schmidt as a student and as a teacher. He was first student and then became a teacher. And these are three totally different designs. These are two copies of teaching material, still with the idea of geometric elements to create a typeface. Today we know that's a wrong approach because type still comes from writing and not from geometry. So the characters are geometrical forms, but you have to adapt them to our perception. You see this result of the concentration on geometry in this titling of the Bauhaus magazine. In comparison to, say, a Bodoni or a Garamond or a traditional typeface, you see that this is totally unrhythmical. Look at the short stroke and the age. You feel, if you look at this, is it a wrong end or is it already an age? It was an intellectual decision to do this, but there was no longer any feeling for type. But you can make errors and learn from them. And I think we have learned from errors like this when we design a typeface. I think Yevgeny could agree. You have learned from these errors. Okay. And this is where Bauhaus design ended too. It's the gate of the concentration camp of Buchenwald. To each one what he deserves. Designed by Franz Ehrlich, a student of the Bauhaus, who drew the plans of the Buchenwald concentration camp as well. Young men and women come to the Bauhaus. This was a prospectus from 1929, when Hannes Meyer, who was working in Russia, especially in Moscow for a while, was director, and he used all typographic possibilities that were available to create a prospectus for the Bauhaus. And this cutout of a hand was a photograph he just had. Another design of that time, different from the typographical designs you saw before, come to the Bauhaus. And it's a kind of nonsense to repeat this phrase, say 16 times. It's easy to say, komm ans Bauhaus, come to the Bauhaus, and then show an image of the Bauhaus, as we have already seen. But at that time, wallpaper was an issue, and the Bauhaus started to sell wallpaper designs to a wallpaper company, the so-called Bauhaus wallpapers. And maybe the wallpaper was in mind when this design was made, because it's the way you design wallpapers. This is a photograph from the Bauhaus building as it is now. You see it's this building, and the lettering now is here. And this lettering is a strange decision, because at that time, 1925, the politics of typography at the Bauhaus were lowercase, strictly lowercase. We write everything in lowercase only. This saves us time. This was right for those who are typesetting, because you have not to stretch out your arm to get an uppercase letter in the typecase, because the lowercase are at the bottom. But for the German language and for the German readers who are used to read text in a mix of upper and lowercase, it doesn't save time for the reader. It saves time for the people who are setting. And I think it doesn't save time for them else, because they will shortly run out of type if they only use lowercase, and sometime there is no longer a W in the case. Anyway, this lettering, which is so famous, if you go to the Bauhaus, anybody of you ever had been there in Dessau? Oh, you had been there? And you had made you a selfie?
No.
When had you been there? When had you been there?
5 years ago, I think.
5 years. Okay, then the selfies were not so fashionable at that time. Okay, but now, if you go there and you watch this lettering, you see people coming around, standing somewhere here, and then the selfie, and then they go. Anyway, this is one of the most famous letterings on a facade. And the contradiction is that at that time, as with the ad I showed at the beginning, the belief was we use only lowercase. And my interpretation of the process is, and there is a model in the Bauhaus archive in Berlin, that the architects of the building Walter Gropius and Adolf Meyer, who did most of the drawings. The architects are used to write uppercase letters. Even in handwriting, they use always uppercase letters. And some of the architects may have written this on the facade to say, well, do it like this. And nobody thought of the typography politics, just only to use lowercase. And in fact, this design is brilliant, and I will show you later more of this. But it's a contradiction to the politics, because the politics were, to save time, we only use lowercase, which was kind of typewriter philosophy. The Bauhaus is situated near the road, which you can see here. At that time, it was called Friedensallee. Now it's in honor to the first director of the Bauhaus, called Gropiusallee. The lettering is situated here. You see this building with the glass facade. You see this bridge we have seen before. And this is the vocational school. And this is now called Bauhausstraße. Before it was a pathway. And the access to the Bauhaus formerly was by crossing the rails. The railway passes by here. If you proceed this road, you come to the railway like here. And the original way was to pass the railway and then approach the Bauhaus. And this is what you could see when you approach the house. And you see the intelligence where they placed this lettering on the facade. This is a telephotograph, and it's made from some 200 meters distant. And you already can see Bauhaus. And the position of this lettering is perfect. If you go closer to this lettering, you see that all letters have the same width, though they are different letters. If you look at a standard font, you will not find B and A and U and H all the same width. But, and I suppose Herbert Bayer did it, but nobody knows. There's no proof who did it finally. But it's likely that Herbert Bayer did it because he did a lot of inner decoration work. So he might have done this too. And that it's likely is his typeface I showed before, his universal type, which has similar forms. All letters have the same width. They are like play elements, all based like Chinese on a kind of square. Whereas an S, usually in a font, never is as wide as an H. But the S is not the standard form, which has a circle and not a flat form. So Herbert Bayer, I say Herbert Bayer, he designed the whole lettering in the same width. But if you look at the facade, there is a certain rhythm. This part and the part on the right side of the facade are of the same width. And if you look at the whole facade, well, I couldn't avoid this pole, sorry for this, and I didn't like to use so much Photoshop to take it away. It's there, and you can imagine what's behind the pole. The rhythm on the whole facade is in relation to the windows which were there before, because the lettering was not in the original design of the building. It was made later. And now the inner intelligence of this lettering. The A is not the usual A. The A is like a mirrored U with a stroke. And this mirrored U and the combination of the A and the U and the A of the U is a certain form of rhyme. I don't know the English word. In German it's Stabreim. That letters or sounds are repeated. Bauhaus. And this sound is realized in forms as well. And to emphasize this combination of forms, the A is formed like the mirrored U. And if you look at the single letters, you have the B as a 3-story letter and the S as a 3-story letter. The S in a kind of pressed form, but related to the B, which has flat strokes on top and on bottom too. So there is a repetition which starts and closes the word. And if you look the position on the wall, it corresponds with the windows, because the middle of the word, the H, is practically in the middle of the facade as well. And you have the combination of A and U twice. And so you have a repetition of the same sign. Together, you have the au, you have the BS as a 3-story element, and you have the middle line. Well, you can say, lucky man who designed this, because the word offered this chance. But despite the official politics for lowercase, they designed to have uppercase for their company logo or for their school logo. So imagine, the official politics were lowercase and the sign were in uppercase, because they condemned all uppercase in their other typography. But for the sign, they used uppercase. And there is no record on how this was invented, or who is guilty for it, or who should be honored for it, whatever you say. From the point of view of the lowercase, he's guilty, but from the effect, he has to be honored. So to use uppercase makes sense, because in uppercase, you have the chance of this imagery. And all letters in our tradition, where we read from left to right, they point to the contents, to the Bauhaus as a contents. And if you look closer, the 3, 2, and 1 story letter at the beginning and at the end. It's repeated by translation, and it's mirrored. I think, say, Herbert Bayer did it. I'm very sure that he did it. The designer hadn't reflected like I am explaining. A designer knows what to do, and he does the right thing. And he did it. We only can analyze it and can see how intelligent and how successful he did his work. But this lettering was a subject for numerous photographs the Bauhaus students did. I think every Bauhaus student who had a camera did a photograph of this lettering, as visitors do today. Because visitors today come around, they come here, and they go along the glass facade. They turn when they come to the corner, and they see the lettering, and they have their handy, they make their selfie, and they go away. So this lettering is riddle in itself, because the politics were lowercase and the reality were uppercase. This was a postcard of the tourist, today we would say tourist information center of the city of Dessau. And you see they are playing with the shadow. This facade is, if you remember the map, southeast. And the sun comes from the right side, seen from your place, and goes round, and the shadow moves from the left to the right. Nobody is standing one whole day there, but everybody who sees it sees a different image. And in the Bauhaus publicity, there was always one photograph with this lettering, shadow like this, or shadow in a direct manner below, seldomly shadow on the left side, because this was in the early morning and nobody wanted to get up this early, probably. And then more lengthy shadow, quite late, and you see how it works. You see the distance of the metal letters from the wall, and you see how fantastic, at a close look, this play on the wall is. Well, when the sun starts on your right, the shadow is off the corner. Only a light gray is visible. And then the sun goes up and the shadow comes closer and it goes a little bit down. And when the sun comes to the top, you have the shadow right below the letters. And then the sun continues. Now I have a problem with my arms. And the sun continues, and the shadow goes more to this side. And you have seen a shadow that is very, very far of the original lettering. And then the sun goes down and the shadow disappears. So you can imagine what the film will show. This film will be shown the first time in the Berlin Typo Conference. And it was made on the 21st of June last year. The shots for the film, it's a time lapse. And those ex-students of the Dessau School of Design are trying to add some music. And hopefully by May, when the Typo Conference in Berlin takes place, they are ready, and I can present them with their film on stage. So
We can put it in our video after.
maybe I must ask them. I just, okay. But I will show you something else. And I wonder what the Yandex School of Design can do. Because the second director of the Bauhaus, the Swiss architect Hannes Meier. Anybody ever heard of Hannes Meier and his work in Moscow? Well, he was important for the development in Russian architecture. And he came with ex-Bauhaus students, the so-called Red Brigade, to Moscow, together with other German and international architects, to introduce the new architecture into Russia, where the new architecture first came from, because Melnikov and others, they started to build to develop new architecture, new buildings for housing, for clubs, and for things like that, and for factories. And Hannes Meier, who was a dedicated socialist, and therefore he was kicked off by the city of Dessau. And then he went to Moscow and tried to introduce modern architecture. But in the politics, in the communist politics at that time, there was already a slight movement in the early 30s that they said the people need beauty. And this modern architecture was for the party too rough, too strict, too poor. They didn't like these straight lines, these rectangle windows, and these flat roofs, all what was modern architecture at that time. And so slightly they asked for decoration, and then you know your metro and you know the buildings near the big roads, and this is what the party wanted to have. And all these Western architects had to leave, and they were disappointed some way, like Ernst May, who came from Frankfurt, or Bruno Taut, who came from Berlin or Magdeburg, and Hannes Meier, who was convinced that these ideas are the right ideas for a new society. Because all what they wanted at that time, from which political edge they came from, they all wanted to create the new man, the new society. They wanted to create all new, not realizing that they were deep into traditions. And Hannes Meier made the last publication of a Bauhaus program. This small publication, it's DIN 5, A5, was the last program the Bauhaus published in 1929. You remember the Bauhaus had to close in 1933, but it had to leave Dessau already earlier. And Hannes Meyer, the new director, made the last program, and he is said to have designed it himself. It's typography, totally unprofessional, but really impressive. In some way, naive. The title is no problem. In this time now, in lowercase. And in lowercase, in one line, it works. But if you think of the lettering on the wall, it never would work to have lowercase. And the intelligence of Herbert Bayer at that time was, though he was propagating lowercase typography, he used uppercase because he arranged a wonderful rhythm with this 1 or 2 or 3 story letters, and the H in the middle, which gives a symmetry, and the AU, which makes a repetition. So there are so many beautiful details in these 7 letters. Now, why doesn't it work? In this booklet, you have everything a typographer shouldn't do. A line which is longer than 60 characters becomes more or less unreadable. But here you have the double amount. And in this booklet, Paul Klee and the first statements explained about art and hazard and construction. In the next spread, you have the theme of reality and life. And just, it's all in German, so I mustn't translate every word. Just to give you an idea how different the spreads are, and that there is really no Bauhaus typography, no style which, why doesn't it work? Yes, it works. And here you see lines that are even longer. Today we would say, no, we can't make a text for reading in this way. But as a spread, as an image, it's impressive anyway. This looks rather normal. It's the program of Wassily Kandinsky for his course about abstraction, about design, and about painting, because he was a teacher not related to any design processes. He was a pure artist, and he was teaching art, fine art. But his ideas of composition can be applied to all design as well, because it's in our natural perception how horizontals and verticals and circles and triangles are perceived. And this is what Kandinsky was interested in. Why doesn't it work?
Let me help you. I just can't.
Oh,
Oh,
okay.
the next one, yeah? Spur.
Yeah.
I'll stay there and I'll change it.
No, it's
Just say me when.
okay. It's the Yannick's presentation computer. I am not used to it, because on my computer I press the arrow and then it works. And you have a special software behind.
Buy software.
Okay. Josef Albers explained something about design, which was not the word of him. Gestaltung, the German word. Maybe the word Gestalt, you know, from Gestalt theory, and Gestaltung in German has this part of this word, and Gestalt theory is the theory of form giving or whatever you call it. So next one. The Bauhaus tried to unlearn everything the students had with them, because they all were trained in schools or have learned about art and beauty in their families and whatever. And the main thing was, I wouldn't say to brainwash, but to unlearn what they are used to think is good design. So they had to experiment with all materials. And here you see a very simple experiment to distort columns of text and create an unseen image. Nobody before had seen an image like this in distorting typeset lines or typeset columns. Yeah? Perfect. And you have programmed 5 seconds now. So, and this is the image I love most because it's the IKEA program. It's just what IKEA later did to elementarize an object and to standardize the parts of the object, because it's cheaper in industry to have one leg 4 times than having 4 different legs. Today, for you as designers, the question is the other way around, because digitization allows to make custom-made objects. You can order your whatever, your Philip stool, and then you get the legs in your kind of form. And it's so easy, but at that time, in industry of the 20s, standardization was the theme. And today, the individualization is what we are asked for as designers. And in programming, you try all time to come very close to the individual that uses it, and probably to catch this individuum for business. This is the backside of individualization, that you catch the individual, whereas standardization turns out to a kind of objectivity and makes it all equal. But nobody today is satisfied to have the same car, the same dress as the neighbor. Everything has in some way to be individualized. So your job is totally different from the approach of the Bauhaus, where individualization was kind of bourgeois, whereas standardization was progress. And I don't know how you feel with all the different sockets and plugs in the electrical systems if you travel around the world. I would like to have standardization in this. So with Russia, it's easy for a German, but if you go to Britain or to America or to China, you have problems. Once in China, I had a computer and nothing fit. And I cut the cable and used the wires. Yes, I did as a child, I did it. And I tried, is there any current? Yeah. So I was used to have naked wires. But this was the only chance in China. I had to give a lecture in Chongqing, because at that time I had a Chinese student, and he invited me to his hometown, Chongqing. And then I was in a military campus where the lecture was given. And the main arguments were about, doesn't anybody forbid this? There was a half-naked woman in an advertising. And I had to explain to the military people that in our society, things are decided not by the government, how an advertising has to look. So anyway, back. Standardization was the issue in the 20s, and even for the Bauhaus. And I think today standardization is good for a lot of things. I don't like to have different sockets everywhere in the world. Fortunately, you have the same sockets as we have in Germany, so we can cooperate perfectly. And this furniture, you see, it's similar to IKEA. IKEA has copied the developments of the Bauhaus. So it's your finger, I think. It's not the software. Yeah.
Wait, come down, and then.
Special.
Okay. This is another spread of the textile workshop. These are details. You must read it now. We go on. This was new with Hannes Meier as a director, as he, as first one, introduced architecture as a subject. So the institution was named Bauhaus. That means house of architecture. Bau is building. And the main objective was that the building comprises all arts. Only in 1928 they had started with architectural courses. So this is about another technical issue explaining an invention of office chair with some, today we would say, ergonomic aspects, but this is quite rough. Go on. Bauhaus, the magazine, which is still a good source to study what the Bauhaus did, and on the left you see Joost Schmidt, an image of Joost Schmidt, and some experiments with material, these basic experiments to unlearn what the students had in their heads from their training before, their traditional art training. The Bauhaus tried to go to the basics, to the poor forms, to the abstraction, and there was no decoration. There were experiments with space and with weights and with colors and with shadows and all this.
It's easy.
Magic. It will come? Or should? So the program, it's, I won't explain. Hey, it's easy. It's about photography. You would say, if you ever have tried to make typography unreadable. But if the interest is intense, you will read it. It's the introduction of the first photography courses at the Bauhaus in 1928, because photography before was only a private issue. There were a lot of photographs made by the Bauhaus students and Bauhaus teachers, but there was not photography as a subject in, today we would say, communication design. How did you do it?
Wait, more.
Okay. Okay. Well, another page that explains about architecture, Hannes Meyer, and one of the most famous buildings. About lectures that were given from people who came in. We mustn't read it now. And sports. This is some office stuff, another office stuff. And then feature, the Bauhaus students had an own band. And this band played for events outside too, not only in the Bauhaus. And then the Bauhaus had Society of Friends who supported certain events and the Bauhaus as a whole. About town planning, which was a subject in the architectural department. And then these pages present the teachers in 1929. The Bauhaus theater group, which was not a theater that played Shakespeare or something like this. They tried to invent from elemental forms new theater and visible events, just to let speak form and color and movement. And this page is interesting because it lists how many Bauhaus students were there. 140 are German. 30 come from abroad. 8 from Switzerland, 4 from Poland, 3 from Czechoslovakia at that time, 3 Russians, 2 Americans, 2 from Letland, 2 from Hungary, 1 German-Austrian, 1 Dutch, 1 Turk, 1 Persian, 1 Palestinian, and 1 without nationality. This was to demonstrate that it was an international institution. And the reason why the Bauhaus ideas spread is based on the fact that there were so many international students. 190 are male, 51 are female, 14 are married, 47 are between 17 and 20, and so on until the last line. 5 are members of the Bauhaus band. So this is a statistics just to promote the Bauhaus, because this booklet is a promotional booklet, and it's the last promotional booklet published for the Bauhaus, because times became worse in 1930, and the Bauhaus had to leave Dessau, as it had to leave Weimar before. And in a few years, it existed in Berlin, but no longer as a very powerful institution. It was only the rest of the Bauhaus. And then it was closed down in 1933 when the Nazi government came in force. So the Bauhaus was finished. But the idea of the Bauhaus went to America, and the new Bauhaus in Chicago continued in some way the Bauhaus idea. And after the war in Germany, the Hochschule für Gestaltung in Ulm, with Max Bill as the most prominent designer there, started again to set up a school similar to the Bauhaus. So it could not be similar. The times were different. Imagine, in the time of the Bauhaus, it was 1919 when it was founded. World War I already was ended. And Germany alone had 1.4 million dead and some 3 or 4 million casualties. And in the roads, you saw these casualties without legs and some without arms. It must have been a very, very depressing atmosphere to live there. And then shortly after the end of the war in 1923, you had the big inflation. And you saw at the beginning the emergency money, millions, 2 million, 5 million, 10 million, 1 billion. And you had money of 1 billion marks. But when you had 1 million in the morning, it was only worth, say, 100,000 in the evening. So you had to hurry to buy something. For example, at the beginning of the famous Bauhaus exhibition in Weimar in 1923, $50 cost 1 million. At the end, the same $50 cost 80 million after 3 months. So it must be a time which we cannot imagine. And the depression we had some years ago with the breakdown of the Lehman Bank in the US, I think this affected Russia as well. This was a small thing in comparison with the inflation in Germany in 1923. And this was all ended at the end of 1923, but many people have lost their money, and the Bauhaus had to set up their exhibition while every day the money they had was less. But they were urged by the government to show their results. And this coincided. So the time when the Bauhaus existed was very hard. And street fights in the 20s were usual between communists and Nazis and so. And the Bauhaus, I can imagine, I wasn't there, and the reports are rather scarce on this issue. The Bauhaus must be an island with a little view for a better world, but it ended in 1933. And there was no continuation later. And in the German Democratic Republic, after the war, where Weimar and Dessau are located, they didn't like it. Only when they realized that they could get valuta with the Bauhaus idea, they restored the building, and later they had some profit from tourists who went there. And then the Bauhaus became a value, as it is today, because if some product is related to the Bauhaus, it's worth worth more than without the label. So anyway, Bauhaus typography, you have seen, I didn't mention it all time. Bauhaus typography was no style, there was no consistent program, there were no rules what Bauhaus typography should be. And in this little booklet, you saw so many styles. And it was probably mainly designed by the architect Hannesa Meier, though Joost Schmidt, who was trained in typography, was still member of staff, but maybe he refused to design this because he didn't like the style Hannesa Meier wanted. But as a whole, this booklet is impressive, I think. Why doesn't it work? Okay. And they have repeated like the cry in the market, "Komm ans Bauhaus, komm ans Bauhaus, come to the Bauhaus, come to the Bauhaus, come to the Bauhaus." And this was emphasized with this fat arrow. The back page with a photograph pointing junge Menschen, young men and women, come to the Bauhaus. And this little booklet includes so many styles, but as a whole, every spread is fascinating in its own style. And I try to encourage Yevgeny and his publishing house Schrift to make a facsimile with a Russian translation. As we had planned to publish this book I mentioned at the beginning in Russian, have some copyright issues to fix. But in the way we were talking to the original publisher, Egidio Marciona, we were sitting on his table and he said, well, if it's such a problem, why not make a Bauhaus exhibition in Moscow? And this is what we were discussing yesterday with the Pushkin Museum. And I wonder whether any one of you knows the House of Text, Dom Texter. Anybody knows? No? Okay. This is a new idea, and we agreed yesterday with the director of the Pushkin Museum to have an exhibition there, but our idea is to have a kind of working exhibition. As in the House of Text, text plays a main role. And to understand something like the Bauhaus, you need to read. You can't only look at images. You need to read, and you need to realize the context. And for reading, as almost nobody of you knows German. You know English. You know this? 3 articles? Okay. But I don't think that you can read all these texts and understand.
Not at all.
Yeah, okay, fine. Well, the idea was that it's a working exhibition, and to translate the texts, we would like to invite students from the university to be in the exhibition and translate, and simultaneously the translation appears on the wall. But in the same way, we want to offer a library, some 6 meters, with publications on the Bauhaus from all over the world in different languages. But almost no visitor can read it, and we cannot allow to all visitors to grab the books and use it. So the idea is to have volunteers to sit there and to read, and to study, and make abstracts of the books just to show what's in the book. And for this, I wonder whether we can convince enough volunteers, students like you, just to sit there for 1 or 2 days. Some visitors come by or not, some visitors address you or not, but you study a publication and try to understand. And then you're writing an abstract and you post it to the wall with a little image of the book that everybody knows, well, if I want to learn this, that book should be interesting for me. And I think many of the books may be in public libraries or in the Yandex library, maybe. And therefore, I wonder whether you would be willing as a volunteer, unpaid, to sit in an exhibition on the Bauhaus and study a book for 1 or 2 days and write a little abstract and then say goodbye. You sign it. Okay, I wonder whether this is an idea that would work here, because I don't know you. I have made similar experiments with traveling exhibitions in Germany, but I know my German fellows, and they did it. And even former visitors joined our circus, traveling to the next city, even traveling back to the country where the exhibits came from, to Ireland. But I wonder whether you can imagine to sit there and just study for your own benefit at first hand, but hopefully for the benefit of others too. Anybody can imagine? 1, 2, 3. Okay, if this will happen and if this concept is agreed by the curator, because I'm only a small curator, and I am not the deciding curator. I just offer ideas and try to push these ideas. But if this idea is agreed, I say, go to Yandex. They're wonderful young people, and they will cooperate. Okay. Thank you.